When it comes to creepy, mysterious locations, not many places come close to the Florida Everglades. The marshlands have held an air of mystery for as long as people knew it was there. The Everglades were only ever conquered by the Seminole tribe, who viewed this land as sacred and knew it better than anyone else. They were able to disappear into the maze of waterways and thrive, keeping them safe from the encroaching European settlers, thus avoiding the same fate as many of the other tribes in the American South. As its history continued, the tangle of waterways and thousands of islands became a refuge for pirates and outlaws, as with the case of today's story. One of the more well-known outlaws that came to call the Everglades home was a man named Ed Watson. Today, we'll look at his history, how far his reach was throughout the American South, and the legends that survive about him today. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. Edgar J. Watson was born in Ridge Springs, South Carolina, on November the 11th, 1855, although he wouldn't be there for too long. At an early age, Ed's mother fled South Carolina with both Ed and his sister Minnie to get away from their abusive father, Civil War veteran Elijah Watson. The family eventually made their way to Florida, where they settled with family members of the mother in the community of Fort White, where Ed Watson would spend the majority of his childhood. As Ed grew into young adulthood, though, he began to show signs of a violent streak, mirroring that of his father, a streak that led to one of his first murders. I say first because there's a lot of stories and legends that revolve around Ed Watson's early years. Some stories have Ed Watson committing his first murder at the age of 9 back in South Carolina. According to that legend, young Ed had planted peas the wrong way, and he was worried that the man would tell his father, thus leading to a beating in Ed's mind. So Ed murdered the man before he could tell. Another story has Ed killing a relative as a child, this legend having this as the reason that they fled South Carolina. But this murder in Florida is documented and backed up by an arrest warrant. By all accounts, the victim was Ed Watson's own cousin. There had been some sort of public altercation with another person, and Ed Watson had gone into a verbal tirade when his cousin had simply tried to tell Watson to calm down. Ed's response was throwing his cousin to the ground, then kicking him in the head, where he died from the impact. Ed Watson left him there to die. After it became obvious, though, that the authorities were out for him, Ed Watson fled Florida, making his way out west, all the way to Oklahoma. It was while out west that Ed Watson made the acquaintance of notorious outlaw Belle Starr, staying on her property for a time. Starr herself had had previous run-ins with the law, spending 9 months in jail for horse theft, and was currently out on parole. Having once been associates with a lot of outlaws in her day, including Jesse James and Carl Younger, part of Starr's parole conditions was that she have no further contact with criminals, a condition that Starr seemed to take serious. After finding out that Watson had a murder warrant out on him from Florida, Starr kicked Watson off of her property. This action was one that Ed Watson didn't take too kindly to, though. Days later, he laid in wait in Briartown, Oklahoma, and ambushed Starr as she left a local dance on February 3rd, 1889. Watson took his opportunity and shot Belle Starr in the back with a shotgun, killing her on the spot. He took a second shot as she laid lifeless on the ground, just to make sure the job was done. Watson was captured and tried for the murder, and even though all evidence pointed directly at him, the grand jury found Ed Watson not guilty. Many speculate that this was due to Belle Starr's unpopularity in the area at the time. Watson stayed in Oklahoma for a while longer and gained a pretty bad reputation. As time went on, Watson became the suspect in several more murders, both in Oklahoma and in Arkansas. Ed Watson soon found himself as a suspect of multiple murders and assorted skullduggery claims, but whether he was guilty or not never came to light. Either way, Watson wasn't keen on sticking around and pressing his luck any further, and despite the lingering warrant hanging over his head back home, he returned to Florida somewhere around the year 1891. He wasn't back in Florida for long before he was alleged of killing again, this time a man named Quinn Bass in Arcadia, Florida. Watson was captured and tried for that crime as well, but was acquitted by a grand jury on a plea of self-defense. Luck seemed to shine down on Watson again as he got in and out of the system in Arcadia before the knowledge of his pending warrant came to light, so he hit the road again. Trouble found Watson again, though, in Columbia County, Florida, when he was accused of killing a man named Sam Tolland. Again, Watson was acquitted by a jury, and again, he was able to avoid the pending arrest warrant. Not convinced by the outcome of the jury, though, Columbia County Sheriff J.A. Bethia ran Watson out of town. Ed Watson seemed to know that his luck would soon run out, though, so he decided to go into hiding. And what better place for an outlaw to hide out in the state of Florida than the Everglades? In 1892, Watson moved to an area of the Everglades known as the 10,000 Island Chain, buying some land on the Chatham Bend River in Monroe County. Here, he took to growing sugar cane and selling distilled syrup to the surrounding towns under a business he called Island Pride. He did pretty well for himself in this venture too, eventually buying a 70-foot schooner to transport his sugar, and expanding his sales to Fort Myers, Tampa, and Key West. It's reported that on one of these trips, Watson got into an altercation in Key West with a man named Adolphus Santini and slit the man's throat. Santini survived, though, and Watson ended up paying the man off to drop the charges at a price of $900. As Ed Watson's wealth continued to grow, he acquired more and more land, including land on Lost Man's River. With the expansion of his operation, though, came the need for more and more workers. And rather than pull workers from the surrounding communities, Watson opted to get workers from places on his syrup transports around Tampa, Tarpon Springs, and Key West. Watson recruited workers that were mostly single men with no family connections whatsoever, outsiders to the area, men that were not known to anyone. Word started to spread that the true reason for Ed Watson's ever-growing wealth was that he would not pay his workers. He would wait until workers demanded their pay. Then, rather than pay them what was owed, he would take them out and kill them, burying them in shallow graves throughout the Everglades, or simply dumping the bodies into one of the many tributaries around, letting the alligators and turtles clean up after him. What remains were found could not be identified, since no one knew who the workers were. The heat started coming down on Ed Watson after a young boy witnessed him killing a local woman named Hannah Smith. The boy reported this to several farmers in town. It took some convincing on his part, but the boy finally talked the men into following him to the spot of the burial, where the remains of Hannah Smith were actually recovered. The last straw, though, came when Ed Watson's rage was turned to a local family. The Tucker family was well liked in the community and had been farming that area of the Everglades for decades. Ed Watson had found the Tucker family farming on his land on Lost Man's River and attempted to run them off. The Tuckers informed Watson that they had been farming that area for years and were unaware that it had recently been purchased. They agreed that they would pack up and leave, but only after their crops were ready and harvested. Watson responded by murdering the entire family and dumping their remains in the river. When their remains were discovered, this time it was the remains locals could identify. The murders were reported to local Sheriff Frank Tippins, but Sheriff Tippins told them that the Chatham River region was outside of his jurisdiction. So the townspeople had no other choice but to take matters into their own hands. Their plans were cut short, though, as a hurricane came barreling into the area, bringing storms to the Everglades for 2 weeks between October 3rd and October 23rd of 1910. They were forced to hunker down and wait out the storm, but then picked up their plan on the first clear day. On October 24th, 1910, Ed Watson sailed his schooner to Chokoloskee Island. As he came out of the small trading post and general store called the Smallwood Store, Watson was confronted by angry townspeople. Ed Watson admitted to the killings, but stated that it wasn't him that had done them. He blamed his foreman, a man named Leslie Cox. Watson went on to say that he had killed Cox because of the crimes, and even produced Cox's own hat to the crowd as evidence, complete with a bullet hole in it. The crowd wasn't buying the story, though, and demanded that Watson come with them. They were prepared to take Watson and turn him in for an investigation. Watson wasn't going to have any of it, though, and raised his shotgun on the crowd. But when his shotgun misfired, the angry mob opened fire themselves, shooting Ed Watson dead on the spot in the entryway of the store. It's reported that Watson's body contained 33 bullet wounds. Ed Watson's body was then dragged behind his own boat to nearby Rabbit Key and buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. Witness statements were taken by the local sheriff, but no charges were ever filed. In a statement by Ted Smallwood, owner of the Smallwood store, quote, "If no one is innocent, no one can be guilty." 3 weeks later, though, Walter Langford, a son-in-law of Watson's, dug up the remains and had them moved to Fort Myers Cemetery. Today, there are still some surviving relics of Watson's time in the Everglades. The Smallwood store where he was gunned down still stands, now operating as a small museum. Watson's homestead is long gone, but researchers have been able to pinpoint its location, and there are still some surviving syrup stills on the property, hidden away in the encroaching overgrowth. The area today continues to be steeped in paranormal tales, both there and beyond into the vast waterways of the Everglades, and one can't help but wonder how many spirits the actions of Ed Watson added to the region due to the countless number of bodies he was said to litter the waterways and grounds therewith. Restless spirits in an unforgiving land is an interesting mix. Who knows what all someone can encounter there? And by no means is the story of Ed Watson the only one to come out of the Everglades. Lost plane crashes, ghost ships, a lost city, the Calusa tribe with their human sacrifices and alleged supernatural powers. The list goes on and on. It's safe to say, and pardon the pun, but we've only just begun to get our feet wet in the Florida Everglades.